We have been talking about the past with Lou Perez giving us this lens of Cuba sovereignty, and John Coatsworth, interestingly, advising us as journalists to look not just at the leaders, but at the visible leaders, but at the technocrats, at the people who are managing change at any moment in history. Our next speaker is going to take us on a tour of another hidden layer of the past. Peter Kornbluh and I share an affiliation, one that I'm proud of. We're both on the masthead of The Nation magazine. But anyone who has done any reporting at all on the secret history of the Cold War, on abuses by U.S. government agencies, on the Freedom of Information Act, has dealt with the National Security Archive, and at one point or another has interfaced with Peter's enormously important work on the role of U.S. agencies and U.S. government in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. He has a new book, Back Channel to Cuba, which he is going to talk about. Someone here said that our previous speakers, Lou Perez is the Al Pacino of Cuban history. I think that means, looking at Peter, that he must be the Bobby De Niro of Cuba history. So come on up.
One of my great moments of working on Cuba was to be a historical consultant to Robert De Niro's The Good Shepherd, which of course is built around the whole issue of the Bay of Pigs and secret back and forth. So I've spent some time with him on this issue, and it's funny to be compared to him, frankly. Listen, I want to thank Bruce and everybody here at the Dart Center and at Columbia. I was an adjunct professor here for 7 years in the 1990s, and it's just wonderful to be back on campus. And this is just an extraordinary group to spend time with. I find myself in the middle of a media coverage of Cuba kind of experience, if you will. I'm kind of both writing about it, sometimes as a journalist and author, but I've also just spent a lot of time kind of pushing some of the people in this very room to cover the stories that are in the book that's just come out, Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana. And of course, the first story to come out of the book was in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. And it was about how Kissinger had gotten very angry at the end of a concerted secret effort to normalize relations with Cuba. And the Cubans had done what? They had sent troops into Angola. And how could this little pipsqueak Fidel Castro, as Kissinger liked to refer to him in the private sanctum of the Oval Office with the President of the United States, do what the United States does around the world, send troops someplace and project their power and influence in such a faraway continent. And he basically up and said, we have to clobber the Cubans, we have to humiliate them, we have to push them out of Africa. And the president said, I agree. And Kissinger said, we might have to wait until after the 1976 elections are over. And luckily, Carter won the elections, and we'll never know what would have happened with Cuba and the United States. But this is an interesting experience. This story got a lot of attention around the world, but of course it's not at all indicative of what's in this book. The entire book is about dialogue and civil discussions, and some of them very secret but still civil, between the United States and Cuba over a long period of time, 55 years. And so the story that led in the press was not emblematic and representative of the book at large. And it does say something to us, and we're all out there looking for a story, but in many ways, of all the stories in the book, the one that I knew would get the most attention was the one about aggression. War tends to attract somewhat more media attention and war plans than peace plans. I'm reminded of a comment that McGeorge Bundy said to me when I interviewed him about John F. Kennedy's secret diplomacy with Cuba. I said, why was Kennedy doing this? He said, well, he wanted to see what was possible. The problem was how to do it secretly. We had the dirty war department, but we didn't have the peace department available to us. And so the kind of back channel efforts had to be done very carefully and were kind of new to us. But the Cuban narrative that Bruce referred to, he referred to it as a stuck narrative, but the narrative has been dominated by these war plans and by the actual low-intensity war that's taken place. You think of Cuba and you think of all those colorful and sinister CIA assassination plots against Fidel Castro. You think of the Bay of Pigs paramilitary invasion. You think of the world coming to the edge of Armageddon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You think of the embargo and colorful covert programs and sinister programs such as Operation Mongoose. And those are the things that people talk about when they come to Cuba. But in fact, dialogue is the story. Dialogue is the story of the future. As Lou Perez just told us, it's inconceivable that we're going to go on forever without eventually normalizing relations, but actually the dialogue is the story of today and tomorrow. It is the story of the past as well, but it's just a much lesser known and less documented story. It's a story over more than 55 years that was largely carried on in secret because of the political sensitivities of actually talking to the Cubans. But it has been a big part of this history that we've gone through. And our mission in doing this book, which took almost 20 years to do, was to basically supplement the narrative of what Henry Kissinger called perpetual hostility in U.S.-Cuban relations with the untold story of the talks that went on at many, many levels in many different countries, in many different cities, and in many different places. In this very city, you had secret talks that went on at the Pierre Hotel, room 727, between Kissinger's guys and Fidel's guys. You had talks at the St. Regis. You had talks in the Oak Room down the road there. Where else? That famous French restaurant, Côte Basque, I think it was called, which no longer exists, was the scene of some secret talks as well. And they were very, very important, and the historical record that they leave behind was very, very important and very relevant. And the argument here is to bring this history to the surface, let all of us know about it, and make it a little easier for the current president, if not the next president, to have a historical foundation upon which to build some type of more open dialogue with Cuba. Dialogue is the story today, I would argue, for you, and tomorrow, and dialogue has been a very, really important story of the past. There are two things, if we're going to do this in a nutshell, which we have to for reasons of time, that we take away from looking at this history in great detail. One is that, oddly enough, every president since Eisenhower has had some reason to talk to the Cubans. Every president, including some of the most hardline presidents. And talks have gone on in all of these administrations. The second takeaway is that Fidel Castro, despite all of his anti-Americanist rhetoric, has also pragmatically reached out to almost every single president early in their first term, to see whether some type of dialogue and accommodation would be possible. This is not only limited to presidents that would seem most likely to be responsive, like Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton, but presidents who were lifelong, die-hard anti-communists and Cuba haters like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And in almost every case, Castro has reached out. When we talk about the narratives of the two sides of this history, we can start really with the Kennedy administration, in which so many things happened. Kennedy is known as the president that green-lighted the Bay of Pigs invasion, even though he inherited it from the CIA under Eisenhower. He was the one who implemented the embargo. He set his brother out there to organize Operation Mongoose. And of course, during the missile crisis, he authorized those troops in Miami to be prepared to attack and obliterate Cuba if he couldn't resolve the crisis peacefully. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on that people don't know about. And he had one aide to McGeorge Bundy in the National Security Council named Gordon Chase, who people really haven't heard about. He died young, and he was very focused on changing the discussion inside the Kennedy White House. And this memo, which I've pulled out just to show you, is an illustration of this. We call this the Sweet Approach memo, where Kennedy is now considering a new CIA proposal for a new round of covert operations known as autonomous operations against Cuba. And Gordon Chase writes, look, the president's going to be looking at some more violent solutions to the Cuban problem. It might be interesting if at the same time he could have a look at a feasibility study on a policy turnaround. Instead of the nasty approach, we could take the sweet approach and entice Castro over to us. This was extremely sensitive. Talks with Cuba went on through intermediaries. Down here, where Castro is pointing, is the story that's known the best. Jean Daniel, who was with Fidel Castro at the time of Kennedy's assassination and wrote about it. You'll be interested to know that there are three intermediaries here in these pictures. Two of them are journalists. Journalists used as secret intermediaries, and one of them, the other, is a lawyer. So we had a lawyer and two journalists being used as secret intermediaries. And let me just quickly share with you, what they did. The lawyer, James Donovan, was recruited by the Kennedys to free the Bay of Pigs prisoners and to arrange this famous trade of $60 million or so in food and medicines for more than 1,000 of the Bay of Pigs brigades and their family members. Then the CIA asked him to go back and gain the release of all the Americans that were in Castro's jails. And three of those Americans were bona fide CIA operatives from the Technical Services Division who had been caught red-handed in 1960 bugging the ceiling of the Chinese news service, which the CIA wanted to eavesdrop on as a way of finding out not just what was going on in Cuba, but what was going on in China as well. And so they had been arrested, and his task was to get all of these Americans out. And there was a prisoner swap, which is relevant to the discussion today, how this happened. Eventually, but very expeditiously, Kennedy agreed to swap 4 Cubans that were here in New York for these 27 Americans, including the 3 CIA agents. And the 4 Cubans that were here were every bit as politically dicey as the 3 Cuban spies that are still in prison here. One of them had accidentally shot a 9-year-old Venezuelan girl in the back and killed her during a bar fight, basically, in 1960. And the other 3 had been accused of, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, of coming to New York and planning sabotage operations, presumably if the United States attacked Cuba during the missile crisis. So he eventually gained the release of those. There was this prisoner swap. The woman in the picture, Lisa Howard, does anybody here remember her, know anything about her? Anne Louise, of course. So Lisa Howard was one of the great famous journalists of her day. She was called the first Barbara Walters. She was ABC News' first female correspondent when it was a completely man's world. She was the first woman to have her own news show, which aired at 2:55 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, for all the women at home at the end of the kind of soap operas every afternoon. It was called News with a Woman's Touch, sponsored by Purex. And she became the key secret intermediary between Cuba and the United States at the end of the Kennedy era and through the first year or so of the Johnson administration as well. She peppered her way into getting permission to go to Cuba. She did the first major network news special, an hour-long special on Castro, interviewing him. And when they were off the air, on the air he was very positive. He had just completed this prisoner exchange with Donovan, and he was saying maybe this could lead to a discussion of broader relations. That was on the air. Off the air, he talked to her at some length about his interest in improving relations. And when she came back, literally CIA officials were waiting in Miami to debrief her, because in those days, not a lot of people got to spend time with Castro, and they wanted, and were willing to talk about it to the U.S. government. So they debriefed her, and this memo from Richard Helms went to the President of the United States. That's what that little PSAW mark at the bottom is there. The President saw, basically saying Castro's looking for better relations. This newswoman, Lisa Howard, would like to be the intermediary, and she worked very hard at bringing the two sides together. Her apartment, which was on 74th and Fifth Avenue on the east side, was used as a communications central for phone calls between U.S. officials and Castro's office. The United States and Cuba, with her as an intermediary, were actually setting up a meeting for the first time between high U.S. officials and Cuban officials with an agenda to discuss actual relations. And that meeting was kind of started to gel on the 19th of November, 1963. 72 hours later, the president was dead. Jean Daniel, the other journalist, had carried a message from Kennedy to Castro. They were together when word came in that Kennedy had been killed in Dallas. The first thing Fidel Castro said was, "They're going to say we did it." And the second thing he said was, "There goes your mission of peace." And that was the case. Now, yeah, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. Later? Later. Here we go. Well, now yeah. Anyway, let me go back to this to the second takeaway, which is Castro has reached out to every president. You'd think after the Bay of Pigs, when the United States actually attacked Cuba, that the breach would have been permanent. But literally within 5 months of this April attack on Cuba, Fidel Castro sent Che Guevara to this conference in Uruguay, an Alliance for Progress conference. He knew U.S. officials were going to be there. Che came with a big box of cigars for President Kennedy. He dared Kennedy's aide, Richard Goodwin, to smoke one of them, and the talks began at that point. And this is Goodwin's memo from those talks. It was what we call the first episode of cigar diplomacy on the part of the Cubans. And Goodwin famously tells the story that he brought these cigars back, this beautiful mahogany box, to Kennedy's office. Kennedy was really excited, cut the end, lit one up, and turned to Goodwin and said, "Maybe you should take the first puff." An oblique reference to, of course, the CIA's plan to perhaps assassinate Fidel Castro by poisoning a cigar. So that was literally Castro's first effort, already still in 1961, to reach out to Kennedy and see if after the Bay of Pigs, there still might be possibility of finding some common ground. Kennedy was killed as those efforts were coming to fruition. What does Castro do? Very early on in the Johnson administration, he gives Lisa Howard a private message for Lyndon Johnson saying, we want you to be aware that we were in these talks with Kennedy. We want to tell you that we are willing to continue these talks with your administration. 3, we understand it is a political year in the United States, 1964, and that you're going to be running against some hardliners, whether it's Barry Goldwater or Richard Nixon, and that you're going to have to look tough on us. And we'll understand if you want to say nasty things about Cuba, if you even want to, like, attack us in some gentle way, as long as you tell us you're doing this for political reasons, we will understand. And then the 4th point he made, and this is very, very important for today and for all this history, I want you to be clear that I am not making this gesture to you out of weakness. If you interpret it that way, it'll be a huge mistake on your part. And Lisa Howard did eventually pass this message to Lyndon Johnson through Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador. I think one of the most astounding things that we found doing this book was this message that Castro sent to Nixon, which he actually put in motion only 11 days after Nixon's inauguration. Nixon, of course, as you can see, the picture on the front of the book is this famous moment when Castro came to the United States in April of 1959 after the revolution and met Nixon for an hour in his congressional office. They didn't get along at all. Nixon came out of the meeting and then kind of in his book publicly said that he was dedicated to overthrowing Castro from that moment onward. But in fact, he wrote a long memo of conversation for Eisenhower about the meeting in which he basically said, Fidel Castro seems very naive about communism, but he also is very charismatic, and he's going to be a leader of men in Latin America, and we have no choice but to, quote, guide him, as he goes forward, very pedantic. But when Nixon became president, Castro used the Swiss embassy, which was kind of the official diplomatic middleman after the break of relations, and he sent this long message to Nixon about offering to negotiate differences, and even put the idea of Cuba kind of pulling out of its contacts with the leftist forces in Latin America, one of the key issues that the United States had with Cuba. At that point and during the Cold War, repeatedly the U.S. position was break relations with the Soviet Union and get out of Latin America, stop supporting those guerrillas in Colombia and Venezuela and Nicaragua and et cetera, and maybe we can talk. And here he points out we should all stop interfering in Latin America, meaning he would if the United States would. It took a little bit of time for this gesture to percolate, but this is, I would say, for all of us thinking about today, this history of Kissinger and Castro is the most relevant. This is the moment, in my opinion, when the United States actually and Cuba could have normalized relations, because Kissinger didn't give a flying you-know-what about democracy and human rights. He'd just be fine with Pinochet, be fine with Castro. That was not on his agenda. His agenda was kind of the world global plan and the possibility of détente and creating much more stable, influential areas of U.S. influence in parts of the world and Soviet influence in other parts of the world and keeping that going. And so he thought that if he offered an olive branch to Fidel Castro, he might be able to mitigate Castro's international behavior. He actually sent a handwritten note to Fidel Castro through a Democratic operative named Frank Mankiewicz in June of 1974. Mankiewicz was going down with Kirby Jones and Saul Landau, people who some of us in the room know. And eventually they were to set up an interview with Dan Rather. Became a very famous interview in later in 1974. And all of this led to two key documents, a whole series of secret meetings. If you look over there where the document with the R on top is, this is Kissinger's initial message to the Cubans. Basically, he says, we've had détente with other countries that we have ideological differences with, and we can have a détente with you. Just because the ideological difference between our two countries is deep does not mean we can't find common ground. And then the other document here is the first page of a 15-page memorandum of conversation of a 3-hour meeting at the Pierre that took place in July of 1975. Of course, Cuba at that time was becoming head of the non-aligned movement. Fidel Castro's independence of his own foreign policy, his solidarity with the Third World, at that point was a higher priority for him than continuing on this discussion with the United States about normalizing relations. And so, and another electoral year, the equivalent of 1964, 1976, came around. Ronald Reagan was challenging Gerald Ford in the primaries, attacking détente, attacking any soft position on Cuba, and the United States basically abandoned kind of the effort to improve relations with Cuba. But Jimmy Carter picked them up. He came in, he was the first president to secretly order his national security staff to try and normalize relations with Cuba. And this is his directive, which he signed only a handful of weeks after being inaugurated as president of the United States. There were many intermediaries, again, these series of secret meetings during the Carter period, meetings that took place in Atlanta, in New York City, in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and culminating in a meeting face-to-face with Peter Tarnoff and Robert Pastor and Fidel Castro in Havana. You also had Cuba deciding that it would reach out to the Cuban American community for the first time, and used a very prominent Cuban American banker named Bernardo Benes as an interlocutor. He eventually achieved the release of hundreds of political prisoners in Cuba, and the permission for them and their families to immigrate to the United States. It was well over 3,000 people. It may have been close to 7,000 people at the end when all the family members were counted and left. And so when you go back to the Carter period, you had this amazingly long and complicated dynamic. But again, Carter, as you know, was beset by crises towards the end of his presidency. He hoped to have a second term, and the Mariel boat lift came, and he sent a secret emissary down, whose picture is not here. Let's see. Yes, J. Paul Austin, the chairman of Coca-Cola. This is one of the unknown stories of secret diplomacy with Cuba, that the chairman of Coca-Cola was used as an emissary. And Austin was sent down to offer basically bilateral talks to normalize relations in the second term if Fidel agreed to actually terminate the Mariel boat lift. A number of problems developed with his visit. He actually, instead of following his instructions, said to Fidel, "Jimmy Carter wants to have a summit meeting with you before the end of the year." This is in 1980. And the United States is willing to lift the embargo before Christmas. And when he came back and told the Carter White House that he had said this to Fidel, they were extremely upset that he had not followed his instructions, and they immediately sent Peter Tarnoff down, a U.S. State Department officer, to clarify to the Cubans that J. Paul Austin was speaking on his own behalf and not on Carter's behalf. But they basically offered essentially the deal that they wanted to offer: end the Mariel boat lift, because if it continues, Jimmy Carter is going to lose this election. A second term, we will address the larger framework of relations. Of course, Jimmy Carter did not have a second term. He had the crises of Afghanistan, of the Mariel boat lift, of the hostage crisis in Iran. I mean, it felt at the end of his term somewhat like it feels today for a besieged president, kind of the world out of control. He lost to Ronald Reagan, and of course Reagan took a somewhat different position. These are pictures of a number of the colorful and important intermediaries that were used at the time during the Reagan era and later in Clinton. Gabriel Garcia Marquez had 3 separate trips to Washington carrying messages from Fidel Castro to Bill Clinton. Bill Richardson was used a number of times, most recently in an effort to try and get Alan Gross released from prison in Cuba. Jimmy Carter himself, as an ex-president, was enlisted to be an intermediary to end the Balsero immigration crisis in 1994. Let me just finish, or come to an end here with this history by talking just for a moment to set the stage for Greg Craig's talk about kind of where we are at this very moment here. I have seen Alan Gross in Cuba twice over the last year and a half for a total of 7 hours. And I came away convinced that he's not going to last that much longer there. This is the issue of a prisoner swap. It could be termed as a humanitarian gesture. You see in the history of dialogue with Cuba that this has been done before. In both 1963, it was a humanitarian gesture and exchange, and in 1979, it was actually a detached release where Fidel Castro wanted the Puerto Rican nationalists, Lolita Lebrón and others who had been in U.S. prison for years, decades by then, released in return for the release of a number of Americans, including Larry Lunt, a CIA officer who had been operating in Cuba and had been arrested. And that was negotiated very kind of skillfully and tactfully. It was not something that happened on the same day. It didn't happen the same week. It happened several months apart. But it was a gentleman's agreement. You release these guys, and later we will release those guys. And the United States government went through the process of the Justice Department recommending clemency for the Puerto Rican nationalists who had shot up the Congress and killed a security officer. I mean, this was politically very, very difficult and delicate, even 30 years later, but it was done, and it happened, and it had an interesting precedent for today. This history becomes immediately relevant, and that is because there is a summit coming up in Panama in 5 months in April, and both the United States and Cuba, for the first time, will be invited. And this is the status of the situation, which I hope we'll hear more about in the next hour. We have a window. It's a diplomatic window, but it's a window in which, for all the other crises and problems in the world, Cuba is got to be on the president's agenda. He has to decide, one, if he's going to go to Panama and be the first president of the United States to sit across a conference room table in a multilateral regional meeting with the president of Cuba since the Cuban Revolution. He has to decide if he is going to fulfill a campaign promise that he made when he was running in the primaries against Hillary Clinton, and famously during a CNN town debate said, I would sit down with the leaders of states that are hostile to us and try and work out an accord. And she said, well, you can't do that. And he said, I would sit down with Raul Castro. He made that campaign commitment in 2008, and now he has to decide if he is going to honor it. And secondly, if he decides to go to the summit and sit across the table, he has to decide whether he uses that opportunity to change the framework of this policy and use this historic moment for the better, or if he goes and simply yields to the pressures from the right wing and the anti-Castro Cuban American lobby that still exists, and Robert Menendez, and the pressures that he certainly will face, and just goes and basically denounces Cuba for being the one non-democratic country represented at the table. So those are that's the juego, that's the issues in play between now and April. But we are certainly looking at the most extraordinary moment in recent memory for U.S.-Cuban relations. Hopefully, if this history teaches us anything, there will be a kind of a quiet effort between now and then to lay groundwork for some type of really extraordinary result of that summitry. That would be the hope and the expectation if history would teach us anything. I'll leave you by saying that the book starts with a quote from Raul Castro, who you see here in this interesting picture, kind of waiting to shake President Obama's hand at the Mandela Memorial. But let me just share with you this quote to finish from Raul. He says, "Our relations are like a bridge in warfare. I'm not going to talk about who blew it up. I think you did," he's saying to the Americans. "The war has ended, and now we are reconstructing the bridge brick by brick, 90 miles from Key West to Veradero Beach. It is not a bridge that can be reconstructed easily as fast as it was destroyed. It takes a long time. If both parties reconstruct their part of the bridge, we can shake hands without winners or losers." People hear this statement and they think, well, you know, President Raul Castro is saying today that we should do this now. But he made the statement in 1977 to Senator George McGovern and Senator James Abrask when they became among the first senators to travel to Cuba during the Carter administration. And it goes to show you that the Cubans have been thinking about this for a long time. It addresses a question that all of us as journalists covering the story in the coming weeks and months are going to hear. The question being, does Cuba really want better relations with the United States of America? And the history and the declassified documents really does show that they have pushed this issue again and again and again, starting all the way in August of 1961 when Fidel sent Che Guevara to meet with Richard Goodwin. Fidel himself, and I'll finish with this little anecdote, raised the issue with James Donovan as they were negotiating the release, this prisoner exchange, the CIA agents for the 4 Cubans here in New York. He said this was in April of 1963, and he said to Donovan, I can actually read you exactly what he said, "If any relations were to commence between the United States and Cuba, how would it come about and what would be involved?" This was the first time that Fidel Castro articulated himself personally an interest for better relations. How did Donovan respond? We know how he responded because he came back and was debriefed by the CIA on tape, and the transcripts of the tapes were declassified eventually, and we used them for this book. Donovan tells the CIA, as he's relating his conversation, he says, "So I said, Mr. Premier, do you know how porcupines make love?" And this had to be translated for Castro, and Castro finally said, "No." And Donovan said, "Well, I said, the answer is very carefully. And that is how you and the United States will get into this." Now, that was in 1963, 51 years ago, and very carefully has been the operative kind of mode in all those years. It's time to set very carefully aside and go forward. Thank you.
I haven't read your book yet, but I just wanted to know, is there anything in your research that would indicate there's often a perception that there's a pattern that when things are on the brink of a thaw, the Cubans do something that scuppers.
That scuttles the talks, sure. And
at least the sense that
the examples that are raised are the Mariel boat lift, the Balsero crisis, the shootdown of the planes. And our book addresses all of these cases, but what it does is the people that make that argument pick those issues kind of out of context. Okay. And they don't either incorporate into their own thinking or just decide to skip over what was happening, day by day, week by week in U.S.-Cuban relations leading up to those moments. The shootdown of the planes is a classic example. It's not that Fidel woke up one day and said, "I'm going to shoot those planes down." There was a long, drawn-out process in which these planes started to overfly Havana and drop everything from 500,000 provocative leaflets urging Cubans to rise up to tchotchkes and trinkets and those types of things. We heard from Lou Perez the long historical memory that the Cubans have, and of course they have a memory of the early 60s when exile planes used to fly over the countryside and drop gasoline bombs on sugar fields and on factories, etc. And so Castro basically did, I kid you not, they tried every single way to alert the United States that the flight of these planes had to stop. Informal communications, formal diplomatic notes, phone calls from Ricardo Alarcón to Peter Tarnoff, the use of emissaries, including Bill Richardson and some people we knew, Scott Armstrong and Saul Lando, sending one message after the other. The planes can't come anymore. We're going to have to take the matters into our own hands. And this went on for over a 3-month period, and the planes came again. So it wasn't just kind of out of the blue. It was, why is the President of the United States continuing to let these planes come? If you read the book, it's an amazing story of failed back-channel diplomacy, because the message got passed to the Cubans in 2 different ways, that the President of the United States had interceded with the FAA to ground these planes and that they weren't going to come anymore. And then they did come, and Fidel felt betrayed. He either felt betrayed, his position was either the president has betrayed me and his word means nothing, or this group, Brothers to the Rescue, has violated the instructions of the President of the United States, and therefore Bill Clinton shouldn't be mad at me for doing what I have said I need to do for national security issues all along. Should the Cubans have shot those planes down? Absolutely not. Did they try over a protracted period of time to alert the United States that they considered Havana a security zone and could not tolerate repeated violations of their airspace again and again and again? I should just remind everybody that there are parts of this very city that are considered security zones now since 9/11, and all of Washington is considered a security zone, and no little plane can fly over it without clear permission. We've had a few episodes where with a couple of planes have strayed and they've become very close to being shot down. So, you know, given the history, it's all of those episodes that you mentioned and all of that argument, which, yes, we hear again and again and again, are all contextualized in the book. What was happening in the days and weeks before those things took place? And you'll see that in most of the cases, the Cubans had decided that the United States wasn't particularly sincere about the issue of improving relations and acted on that position.
Hi.
Hi.
Why? Why did the Cubans want better relations? I mean, the conventional wisdom says that the antagonism between Cuba and the United States is the reason for being of the Cuban government, that it provides the context for nationalism that has supported the regime. We just heard, that in the previous hour. So why have they been making repeated attempts, in your estimation? Did they really mean it?
I think the answer is relatively simple. The full validation of the revolution comes when the United States and Cuba live in peace and coexist. The United States has been forced and has, in fact, accepted the legitimacy of the Cuban Revolution in the face of the world, and the 2 countries go forward. I think that Fidel Castro has hoped for that validation of his revolution and of the Cuban Revolution all along. Cuban leaders, Fidel, Raul, have repeatedly said, we are willing to live with the United States, but we want to have a coexistence based on mutual respect and the independence of our sovereignty. Very similar to the language that Lou Perez was describing, the Cuban national sentiment of self-determination. And they have said this literally again and again and again, starting all the way back in 1961, when Che Guevara says to Richard Goodwin, we are willing to negotiate a number of things with you, but the one thing that we're not going to negotiate is our system, the sanctity of the system that we have chosen. That's not on the negotiating table. And it became our politics, our political system, and our foreign policy are independent now, and not for you to control or govern as you did in the past. I think that Castro has been, both Castros have been very pragmatic about the utility of better relations with the United States. But if the United States was always going to demand some compromise of Cuba's independence and latitude as a government, in the end, the Cubans were not going to agree to that.
Peter, the secret intermediaries, were they paid either with money, or in the case of the journalists with access and scoops, or in the case of some of the corporate people through contracts?
No, not a single case that I'm aware of any single one of them doing anything but on their own kind of interests, whether it was a kind of a personal interest or a political commitment going forward. The only person who essentially kind of made hay about his role in this was John Daniel, who happened to be with Fidel Castro at the moment that John Kennedy was killed, and you can't really fault him. It was not only a huge story, but it was a historical story that you had to, you really had to report. And he did report it. He wrote a story on the front page of the New York Times, and he wrote a two-part story in the New Republic, all of which came out in the several weeks following the assassination. The U.S. government officials became very worried about Lisa Howard because they saw her as a journalist not to be trusted, and they figured that if she did become a kind of full-fledged intermediary on a permanent basis, that she would eventually go on ABC News and report what was going on between Cuba and the United States, in the middle of the Cold War. And so they basically moved her out in 1964 and started up a series of other kind of back channels using the United Nations here in New York and going around her. But nobody was paid. The chairman of Coca-Cola, of course, wanted Coke to get back to Cuba. He had, I think, this idea that the embargo would be lifted and his friend Jimmy Carter would open the door. But he, like so many other people that have gone to Cuba, basically became entranced with the country and just thought the policy was wrong and pushed forward. But there was not any kind of greed or avarice, really, in any of the specific individuals that we covered. They all make for extraordinarily interesting case histories. The one that doesn't get enough attention is Bernardo Benes, a very wealthy and successful Cuban-American banker who'd come to the United States with $200 hidden in kind of a little compartment of his sport coat, and then gone from that to becoming to building a banking empire in Miami, and who knew the Castros, was approached to be the kind of intermediary with the Cuban-American community. I mean, think about this. The Cuban Revolution, the Castros decided they would reach out to the community in the 70s and try and build a bridge there with the hopes of both reuniting the diaspora and the island, but also, of course, influencing U.S. policy in the future. It was a very interesting strategy. Benes goes to Cuba something like 17 times. The first times went, they put him in makeup and a false mustache and big eyeglasses and a hat and kind of moved him through Jamaica with false passports. He came back and talked to Brzezinski and talked to Cyrus Vance and Dante Fascell. He really didn't give up on this, and he got all of these people off the island and all of these political prisoners freed. And then what happened? The hardline community turned against him, hated him, claimed that he had betrayed them for even sitting down at a negotiating table with Fidel Castro. And his career as a banker was essentially ruined. He now has Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, and only now, I think, when this history is being put in one place, is he getting the credit that he deserves for the courageous efforts that he made.
Time for two more. Make them both quick and structured so we can do this. Yeah, Annie, go. With your mic.
Hi, Peter. I had a couple of just questions. If the summit is before the midterm elections, then he's not going.
No, the summit is in April of 2015,
Right.
and the
Then
midterm
he'll
elections
go.
are in
Then
November.
It would seem he would go, so there's a light on the horizon.
I would say, though, when I, at the Mobile conference we did when Bill Rogers was still alive, and the way Bill Rogers saw the torpedoing of the Kissinger-Rogers talks that he did is the way Bill put it was, look, we had it all worked out, we had Sanchez Perotti, da-da-da-da, and we said to Fidel, there's only one line in the sand. If you go into Angola, it's toast. And basically, Fidel, this is what he told the conference. So that was his perspective. On the other, with the shoot downs of the Hermanos de Rescate, Alarcón, we learned, talked to sources I interviewed, very high level, and put together a memo and said to Fidel, this is what we learned. If you shoot down those planes, X, Y, and Z will happen, Fidel. And right off the top, the Helms-Burton bill will pass. And Alarcón, according to what my sources said, was fit to be tied. So I'm just saying there's two narratives here where you can see, I agree with you, the contextualization of all those issues, how frustrated they felt in their history. But there were also key people who said, Fidel, here's the line in the sand, and he said, you know what, I'm walking over it.
Well, I don't want
the other
to. I don't want to leave that story, which is factually incorrect. The Cubans sent the troops and advisors into Angola surreptitiously, and the United States found out about them after the fact. And there was no warning in advance to Fidel, if you go into Angola, XYZ is going to happen. The issue, of course, was, as you portray it, U.S. officials could not understand, and they basically saw it as you suggested. Why would he sabotage the best opportunity for better relations with the United States by sending troops into Angola? And the question for people, of course, who know Cuba and know Castro and know Cuban foreign policy is why indeed. Africa was important to Fidel. He was about to become head of the non-aligned movement and host a huge third non-aligned movement summit in Cuba. He had received a request from a legitimate government in Angola to protect itself from CIA-backed and supported rebels pushed by South Africa. He saw himself on the side of history, which of course he was. For those of you who are really interested, and I have to say this story has not been written, in the Kissinger contingency plans for attacking Cuba, you see he is so worried about the Cubans forcing him to back the South Africans. He is worried that Cuban troops are going to move towards South Africa, and the United States will be left to say, we're going to send troops to support the pro-apartheid regime of South Africa against these leftist forces of Cubans and the Angolans. And you see this resonating. He wants to attack Cuba before that happens, so he doesn't have to make that choice.
But Peter, that was what Bill Rogers said.
I was hoping you could maybe talk about whether you think in the U.S. there has been attempts to scuttle progress towards some sort of resolution, particularly by the intelligence community.
Absolutely.
Because obviously a lot of blood, a lot of treasure has gone into this dark, covert world of dealing with Cuba and a regime that is still there. So can you talk just a little bit about
There's
that?
a whole evolution of that. Every administration, as we write in the books, has their hawks and their doves. And we try and chart who they were throughout all of the administrations. And there were some wonderful people. Bill Rogers, who some people in the room may have known, he was Kissinger's Assistant Secretary for Latin America in 1975. Not to be confused with the William Rogers, who was actually Secretary of State. He honestly, to answer Annie's question, is he honestly could not understand why Cuba would jettison this opportunity, particularly again with an election year coming up, knowing that it would be very hard politically for the Ford administration to go forward with Cuban troops in Angola. But throughout history, and starting all the way back with the Lisa Howard issue, I showed you this memo from Richard Helms debriefing Lisa Howard, but I didn't show you a memo which is quoted in the book, which was the next day, the director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, sends a rushed memo up to the White House saying, I've heard about this Lisa Howard initiative. I don't want you to pursue this. This will ruin all of our covert relations with the exiles and with the other countries that are helping us in our efforts to overthrow Castro. If they find out we're talking to Castro, we're toast, basically. And that kind of message came through again and again and again. The book opens with the story of Mr. Donovan going to negotiate with the Cubans to get the release of these prisoners. One part of the CIA is basically helping him do this, and another part, the assassination office called ZR Rifle, the Executive Action Office, knows that he's going to bring a diving suit to give to Castro as a present, as a confidence builder, and they want to take the diving suit and poison it. They want to put a toxin in the snorkel and contaminate the wetsuit and assassinate Fidel Castro this way, because they've got a guy who's actually going to be sitting in front of Fidel Castro. And of course, his handlers, who liked him and who wanted him to succeed in getting these three guys out, basically said to him, we're going to keep control of this wetsuit that you're bringing down, and we're not going to let our own guys have any access to it, so this doesn't happen. So this is the historic kind of back and forth. It plays out throughout every administration in one form or another. Not just the CIA opposing it, but hardliners opposing it. And I guarantee you there's a discussion going on in the current administration along the same lines.
All right, Peter, thank you. Clearly, this is, as with everything today, a conversation that could go on.